the Spirit Box podcast, exploring folklore, esoterica, and the mysteries of the spirit world. I'm your host, Dara, and I invite you to join me in this exploration, from the secrets of the jinn to the whispering of demons and everything in between. Hello, dear people, and welcome to episode 25. Oh, I'm impressed with myself, 25 episodes. And today, we're welcoming Julian Vayne to talk to us about psychedelic entities and experiences, ritual and healing. And Julian is an occultist and an author of numerous books, essays, journals, zines and articles in both the academic and esoteric press, a regular speaker at events and facilitator of retreats and workshops. His work is informed by chaos magic and lineages with Wicca and Tantra. Julian is also the co-organizer of the Psychedelic Conference Breaking Convention and sits on the academic board of the Journal of Psychedelic Studies. Julian facilitates Psychedelic Ceremony as well as providing one-to-one psychedelic integration sessions and support. He is the author of the celebrated Getting Higher, the Manual of Psychedelic Ceremony, and since 2011 he's been sharing his work through the Blog of Baphomet and is the curator of the wonderful, charming, delightful YouTube series, My Magical Thing. So today we're talking about psychedelic entities, the purpose of ritual and the importance of ritual in relation to psychedelics, and the significant case for psychedelics as medicine. Now, this was a really fun conversation, and Julian's passion for this medicine really comes true, and it's quite contagious. So I hope you enjoy it. I know I really did. And in case you're wondering, the thumbnail art is by the visionary artist Alex Gray, whose work we briefly touch on in the podcast. Now, those of you of a certain age with excellent music taste will recognize his work from the Tool album art for the album Lateralis. The links for Julian's work and for Alex Gray's work will be in the show notes below. So do check them out. As always, there's an open invitation to send me your experiences. If you've seen ghosts, you have the shadow man visit you, you've experiences with jinn, with fairies, with obsession. I want to hear about it. So send me some stories, or drop me a phone message. The links are below. If you like the show and want more Spirit Box in your life, join the Patreon and the podcast Discord. It's the price of a cup of coffee, and you'll get the shows early and a host of other tremendous perks, the best perks. Okay, that's enough preamble. On with the show. Julian, a warm welcome to the Spirit Box. Really grateful to have you on board, and thank you for your time. So, getting straight into things and looking at the experiences people have with psychedelics, the bit that jumps out for me, kind of from my kind of reading on the subject matter, predictably enough, is Terence McKenna and that kind of that phrase he made famous, the machine elves. And I want to kind of open that to you. Kind of, what are the machine elves? Who are the machine elves? What the hell is he talking about for our listeners who may not be experienced in this domain?
Okay, Dara. Well, thank you very much for inviting me onto the podcast. Terence McKenna, there he is. I can't really do the voice. The machine elves of hyperspace. Bless
That's
him.
Pretty good.
Yeah, we only got a chance to chat on one occasion. He had dreadful hay fever, as I remember it. But anyway, that's an aside. The machine elves of hyperspace. I mean, I guess, what are we talking about? Machine elves of hyperspace. So there is a sense for many people, particularly when they take things like NN-dimethyltryptamine, or to some extent orally active forms of that, like ayahuasca, where they encounter things which are have a quality as though they are constructed. So because these are highly visual psychedelics, there's a sense that that we're seeing a machine or a mechanism of some description. So I guess that's the kind of mechanical bit. Elves, because I guess Terence having an ancestry in Ireland. It's one of those tropes to draw on from European kind of cultures, plenty of other things he could have drawn from. But those entities which are in this kind of tricky liminal space, you know, are they goodies? Are they baddies? Are they just mischievous beings? So perhaps there's an element kind of in that. And hyperspace, I guess, because we have a sense that in those states of awareness, we're in a space which is kind of above or beyond or exist in some other relationship to the kind of the reality that we generally kind of occupy. Now, the question about, like, ontologically, what are those things, we can pick apart in all kinds of different ways. I think for me, you know, the direction I come at this stuff from is that my practice, my lineage, if you like, is within the kind of the esoteric, the occult kind of tradition. And so what I tend to think of them is rather like, there's a bit in one of Aleister Crowley's books where he says, in this book are spoken of many things, paths and spheres and angels and beings, and whether those things exist or not is perhaps relatively immaterial. What matters is that by doing certain things, certain results follow. And I think that the subjective experience of encountering what appears to be a radical other, which usually has a teaching of some description, even if the teaching is, you're not meant to be here, boy, or here's a funny thing to kind of, you know, come in at 90 degrees to the rest of your reality. The experience of meeting the other is the fundamental stuff that matters. And then the kind of the secondary question about the ontological existence of these things is very much an interesting thing to kind of play with and to explore. But what really matters is what happens in that communication, what happens in that interaction. Yeah, so I'm currently experiencing you as a bunch of pixels on the screen. You're relatively small. You're on a tripod in my living room, is where you actually are. That's how I'm perceiving you. But of course, in order for us to have a conversation, I have to imagine that there is there's Darren Mason Field, an intelligent, thoughtful human being with his own backstory. He's trying to communicate something to me. So from my point of view, rather than perceiving just a bunch of pixels, I'm perceiving like an other, that arises into my awareness. And it's from that we have valuable interactions, which could be discovery of problem solving. It could be healing. It could be kind of some kind of mystical insight. There could be any number of things that might flow from that interaction. But for me, as an occultist, privileging the subjective truth of the interaction in its own terms is really important. And then we can kind of pick about the psychology and the different mechanisms that we could have to understand what where do these beings arise, what might their status kind of be. But it's the conversation that is really important, and that's usually the thing that ultimately people kind of take away from the experience. We can't really know what happens in the ayahuasca session, what these beings may or may not be, but we can see their effects in terms of the interaction and in terms of the subsequent behaviors that person might exhibit in the world on the basis of what they've learned from that spirit encounter.
Thank you. There's a huge amount to unpack there, and I guess the first bit I think that jumped out to me there was the idea of the conversation. Now I know a lot of people who have partaken in a psychoactive substance, maybe not in a ritual setting, maybe in the kind of the comfort of their own home or something like that, where they would have had interaction, but not necessarily a conversation, and have come back with kind of, startled amazement at kind of what they've seen, but maybe not necessarily a conversation. And
yeah, maybe, okay, that's a good point. I mean, when I talk about conversation, I suppose what I mean is like a meaningful interaction between kind of like separate beings. And often, you're right, in the psychedelic state, I mean, I've had experiences where the entities turn up and they say, I remember one time taking ayahuasca in a beautiful kind of rural kind of setting, just me and another friend, and we'd sort of hiked somewhere and we'd taken the ayahuasca. And there was a point at which the entities, which as is traditional in some of these things, look like kind of weird mantis things, went, just lie down now, we're going to upgrade your software, is what they actually said. and they went down inside me, and like stuff happened, and you know, I think that they did a good thing. I mean, I don't really know. But
That's
yeah, there
so
was a
cool.
sense like more like it's probably better to describe it perhaps as a teaching rather than
I see.
a
Yeah.
true conversation.
Mhm,
Yeah.
mhm. Because that was, I guess, the other side of my question was, within that kind of the learning period and the kind of the kind of not being there just as an observer, slightly in shock. But I know you combine an kind of magical practice with psychedelics, and I mean, going back to Terence McKenna, his whole thing was, there's many ways to achieve this altered state and to kind of have this communication. You know, all of them take a lot of time and a lot of effort. The kind of, you know, meditating in a waterfall, the fasting, the drumming, the pain. You know, you can bypass all of that, you know, and get straight to the point, as it were. But you're combining both. Can you tell me about that?
Okay, so I think that, you know, we know that psychedelics create a state of mind which is very plastic. It's very able to be influenced in a variety of different ways, and we also know very clearly from both kind of indigenous knowledge and from entheogenic cultures with long lineage, and also from relatively recent, you know, 20th century science, that the set and setting, the mindset we bring to the thing, and the environment in which the thing unfolds is of great importance. You know, things like the Good Friday experiment. You get a bunch of theology students, you give them psilocybin, you get them to listen to the Good Friday service. They will have these kind of, you know, very, very powerful mystical experiences. You get people taking mushrooms in other different settings. They will have other kinds of experiences dependent on the setting. So I kind of take Terence's point that, you know, the use of psychedelics, which has always been part of the esoteric tradition,
Yeah.
including in the West. You know, there's a lovely book published a year or two ago, Liber 420 by Chris Bennett, which kind of really unpacks a lot of this stuff. You know, it's part of the Western magical lineage, as well as it is part of the story that you'd find in North and South America and India and so on. But to frame the experience, whether or not that is something that looks like, for example, the peyote circle of the Native American Church, which is, you know, that's a phenethylamine chemical. It's peyote. It's the peyote medicine. It's very pro-social. It's done in a group. There's a drum rhythm, and it's the classic drum rhythm of like hardcore techno played through the night, just like dum 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 dum. That's the only rhythm. There's like a lot of prayerful interaction. There's a lot of kind of like group cohesion, and that's part of the purpose of that ritual. Whereas, although we can have kind of communal ayahuasca rituals that you might have with, say, the UDV or the Santa Daime Church, we also have the whole model of, you know, you take the medicine, you go and lie down in a hammock with the sound of the jungle, or in the modern idiom, you take the medicine, you put on the eye shades, you get the playlist, and you just kind of, the medicine is sort of folded back in and on itself, and the person goes on their, you know, very sort of personal, very introspective kind of journey, perhaps with, yeah, something like one of the tryptamines. And of course, there's all kinds of variation with that, you know, and all sorts of differences depending on the dosage level we use, the material we use, and the context that we use. And I think that when we talk about ritual, human beings are naturally ritual making kind of creatures. Yeah, we take plant sex organs and we give them to people that we love. Yeah, so we take flowers and we give them to people that we love, and we take the same bits of plants and we give them to people who are dead. Yeah, who we're grieving for. And you know, up until the recent pandemic, we would shake each other by the hands as a greeting, like we're ritual doing, meaning making creatures. And so when we drop a psychedelic into somebody's brain, what we can do is, in order to facilitate the way that substance is going to unfold, we can do that by making meaning in terms of the way the session is constructed, and we can kind of take things in lots of different directions. And a lot of the techniques of ritual don't have to look like some kind of, you know, quasi shamanic Native American whatever kind of thing. They're techniques that we actually have implicit within our behavior. So when we toast someone, when we drink a toast to someone and we wish someone well, and we kind of bring our attention to the glass of wine or whatever we have. That's very different from just sipping our glass of wine with our meal. When we take the mushrooms, if we take the mushrooms, for example, and we sit for a moment with the mushrooms in our hands, and we speak to the mushrooms, just like we would with a trusted friend. We say, teacher mushrooms, I'm really grateful that you're here. I'm really looking forward to the opportunity to interact with you and to be with you. I'm looking for, a good, powerful, revealing journey for me, I appreciate you being here. Now that puts a very different spin on it from just kind of gobbling up a couple of pills while you're in the club. Again, nothing wrong with that necessarily, but but by bringing that attention into what we're doing, equally when we come to the end of the trip, we come to the end of the thing and we think that, oh, I'm a bit hungry now. So, okay, so you get the food and you make the food, you're just a bit more conscious about the food. You place the food in front of you for a moment, just like you did the mushrooms 7 hours ago. And you say, okay, so I'm going to be very mindful, very thoughtful about the way about this food. And I don't have to invoke a god or a goddess or a magic spirit or anything. I just have to go, I'm really expressing my gratitude for this food, thinking about how it's come to me, what its connection is, and then I eat the food. Yeah. So I remember I took part in a licensed psilocybin trial at King's College Hospital in London a couple of years back. And so there were 6 of us who were all being dosed with either a placebo or 10 or 25 milligrams of synthetic psilocybin. And I was very pleased. I lucked out and got the 25 milligrams. Or at least I'm pretty sure I did. It was all, double-blind testing. I'm fairly certain that's what happened. And I remember at the end of that experience, for me, as a ritual practitioner, I got to the point where I thought, I'll have some water. So I could have just had a sip of water. There's nothing wrong with that. But what I did was I held the water and I wished for good, clean water for all people on this planet. And I sprinkled a little bit of water just on the floor, just a couple of drips, just to kind of make an offering of it. And then I drank the water. Yeah. So all I'm doing is I'm bringing a certain way of approaching the medicine and approaching the whole of the experience. And that's, I guess, what I mean by ritual, what I mean by ceremony.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It makes a lot of sense. And and you can see as well as that does change the setting as well for people. It alters their mindset before they even take part. It also essentially like good advice.
Yeah. It's like, hey guy, appreciate the moment. If you've got this magical substance which is capable of let's put it in neurological language, so it's capable of turning down the default mode network and revealing these new novel connections in the mind, which can lead to entertaining cross wiring, so the optical bits in the brain and the audio tracking bits in the brain connect, and that means you might get like beautiful fractal images or dreamlike stuff in response to the music, for example. And you also get novel thoughts, you get novel metaphors and understanding, which can pop up. And depending on what you're bringing into that story, it can even be answered to very pragmatic questions. So, the RNA polymerase reaction, which is used amongst other things to test for the presence of virus, that's an insight gained by somebody tripping on acid. Yeah. So who was working in that field, saw this thing and thought, oh, I can see how you could do this. So those insights, which if someone's going in with post-traumatic stress disorder, they come to a new understanding of their trauma, a new insight, a new metaphor to hold that, because of this novel brain state that the medicine creates. That's a powerful and amazing thing. And yeah, we can do this recreationally with our friends, and again, the border between where recreation, therapy, insight, mystical experiences is very, very fluid, but really just appreciating it and paying attention to it, I think is kind of what I like to do, and I think it's helpful for a lot of people.
Yeah, no, I can really see that, and I kind of like certainly talking to, for want of a better word, talking to kind of like normie friends, where you the perception of plant medicines and like this and chemical medicines of this persuasion is very much one that is negative. It's very much kind of, it's the classic kind of tabloid story. Someone thought they could fly, jumped off a roof, etc., etc. but the potential for medicine is absolutely huge. Again, and beyond the insights component that you spoke about, because there's lots of famous cases for that. I mean, I'm going to show my complete lack of memory now, but was it the whole perception of DNA originally
Yeah, no, the Watson Crick one is probably not the
not?
case.
No.
Yeah, it's a lovely folk story.
Is
and
it?
It's great. Probably not.
Yeah.
But the RNA polymerized reaction is
Yeah.
definitely the case. And there was also some research done a few years back in London, bringing people who were mathematicians, engineers, and so on, and asking them to take. They were using LSD as part of the problem-solving process and trying to find like where was the sweet spot, and the answer would appear to be 75 micrograms of LSD is what you want. So not so much that the whole of the place is melting and everything's really weird and you can't remember why you're there, and not so little that it's just gnarly and annoying.
Yeah.
But there's a sweet spot within that. And that problem solving is the same behavior that people exhibit when they go and go into the therapeutic use of this stuff. So a friend of mine, a guy called Ben Sessa, who works with predominantly with MDMA.
Yes.
And yeah, so he's working with most recently with people with chronic alcoholism.
Mm-hmm.
And he and I were having kind of conversations about this, because what he was finding was even with MDMA, which is not typically imagined as a very visionary psychedelic, people who are going into the therapeutic process, and of course they've had all the preparation, all the interaction with the therapists and all of that stuff to create a good set in a good setting, they'll often have like really powerful visual experiences of interacting with, ancestors, mythological beings from their own kind of their own kind of psychic framework. And it's those kind of insights, which are often expressed as a metaphor, that allow the healing to take place. There's a really good example in one of the MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies videos, with a guy who was a veteran from Iraq, I think it was. And he talked about how on MDMA he went down into a basement in his imagination, and he saw down there a creature with red eyes. And this guy had had PTSD, very serious PTSD, treatment-resistant PTSD. And one of his symptoms was outbursts of rage, outbursts of uncontrollable rage. And he went down into this cellar and he saw this creature which had the red eyes, which of course was emblematic of his rage. And he kind of knew this at the time. And he interacted with the creature and eventually embraced the creature and kind of came to a new accord with it. That led to him being healed. So the idea that what you're doing is you're going into a psychedelic state, you have a novel set of neuronal connections that you don't normally have, you're out of the rut of your kind of standard issue, waking ego identity, default mode network state. And this new connection, which at a neurological level is synapses linking and interacting that don't normally, and at a cognitive level is the discovery of, right, so my rage is like a part of me and it's hidden away, and that's the problem, and I need to kind of actually embrace it, and by doing so I can then integrate this into my life in a much better way. Or another example from another piece of work with MDMA was a guy who, serious addictive problems, and would kind of go off into one particular part of the house and would kind of indulge in his particular addiction. And of course, addictions are just ways of trying to mitigate suffering. That's what an addiction is. If people don't know this, they should check out a thing called the Rat Park experiment, which is very, very instructive in terms of why addiction happens and what it's all about. So this guy would go off and go drinking in this particular bit of his house. And his metaphor was that he'd gone through the MDMA experience and he'd installed a skylight in his man cave. Yeah, so he'd installed in his head, that was his metaphor. It's like, I can still have this place of retreat, but now I can make it open to the world. And that led to him no longer drinking. So the problem solving, whether or not the problem is an engineering problem, whether or not it's a problem of difficulties with relationship, internal or external, that's one of the things that psychedelics can give us. And that's why we need to make sure that they're available for clinicians. We are in this situation where These things are heavily legislated against in many cultures at the moment. We're also in a situation, fortunately, where that's changing very rapidly. We're also in a situation, of course, which is quite a little blip. Yeah, a lot of this stuff. I mean, I think that I'm right in saying that in Britain, medical cannabis was only made illegal in something like 1972. So, like, this is all recent. Yeah, this is not been like this forever by any stretch of the imagination. You know, we are unusual, and we're unusual because that whole thing about, you know, Nixon's war on drugs, which was actually a war on the emerging feminist movement, Black Power movement, anti-Vietnam movement.
Right.
That's what it was about. There's nothing about people jumping out of windows. Sure, bad stuff sometimes happens.
Mm-hmm.
People can have problems with these substances just like they can with anything else, but they are also incredibly safe. Psilocybin, you can't eat enough of it to kill you. You physically couldn't get it in your body. There's no known LD50 of it, lethal dose 50. It's like, you know, it's very, very, very safe. You know, as people often say, as David Nutt famously said, you know, things like paracetamol, horse riding, and so on, far more dangerous than these substances are.
Yeah.
Okay?
I mean, that's a really good perspective to hold on this, isn't it? It's a good one to educate people on, because as I said, it's just the perception is this heavily propagandized view that these things are potentially lethal. These things will cause kind of permanent mental damage, and it's just simply not the case.
It's simply not the case. Yeah, I mean, sure, these things make you. These substances make you. They change your relationship with the world in a very, very powerful way, potentially. And so the settings in which we use them need to be kind of considered, and we need to be thoughtful about the way we use them. But to be honest, you know, in Britain, we get through. I mean, some reasonable estimates, we get through 25,000 kilos of MDMA every year in Britain, just in Britain. Right, so that's like 175 million doses at about 200 milligrams or something like this. You know, it's really lots and lots. The number of people who end up with any sort of significant problem from that, even a kind of a secondary problem from, I don't know, you know, famously overheating or drinking too much water, or I don't know, falling over and hurt. It's really small. It's very, very small, and compared to things like alcohol and tobacco, it's frankly insignificant.
Minuscule.
The history of the illegality of psychedelics is very much the history of, in particular, the American fear of the kind of cultural shifts that were happening in the late 20th century. And it's driven by that. It's not driven by empirical evidence. It's not driven by historical precedent. And it's not driven by, you know, anecdotally what seems to happen to the vast majority of people, the vast majority of the time.
And to that point, you know, what is the legal situation now? You mentioned kind of medical trials. I mean, is that being reflected in law? Is there inroads in changing the system at the moment?
No, I mean, certainly in Britain, ever since, I'm trying to think when it was, something like 2015, 2016, we had a thing, you know, there was the novel psychoactives bill, which basically meant that everything that can get you high is by default illegal if you are using it to get high, unless it's alcohol, tobacco, or caffeine, right? So frankincense, for example, frankincense is a mood-lifting substance. Now, in principle, in Britain, the situation is if I walk into you know, a herbalist and I say, I'd like some frankincense, please. If I were to say to the person behind the counter, oh, and by the way, what I'm going to do is I'm going to burn a big load of this so that I feel a bit more happy. In principle, they would be criminally liable if they then sold me the frankincense. If I go into it and say, actually, I'm a Catholic priest and I'm going to be using it in my rituals, or I'm a pagan, I'm going to be using it. In principle, that would be fine, you know? And, you know, I remember reading all the government legislation and the various papers that were brought in to kind of talk about this. There were 4 models that were proposed, and the government chose the most draconian model. And of course, the problem with that, what they were trying to address was spice. They were trying to address the cannabinoid mimic chemicals that were undoubtedly causing loads of problems. frankly, the easiest way of dealing with that would have been simply to decriminalize cannabis. But actually what they did, unsurprisingly, was that they drove prices up, they drove the business underground, they drove the quality of the products into this kind of, black market area, and more suffering has resulted from that. On the other side of the equation, the trial that I was part of was a licensed medical trial, and at the moment, the last time I looked, the trajectory was that within maybe kind of 3-4 years, we would have psilocybin treatment for treatment-resistant depression, that therapy would be available on the NHS within kind of 3-4 years, something like this. That's part of the reason that they were trying to scale it up. Like, can we give this to like 6 people all at the same time in a hospital ward? And the answer is yes. And the other thing that they did was they did what, from my point of view, is a ceremony. So they did like they introduced everyone. You got to meet the person who you was sitting with. They kind of went through the thing about like, is it cool? If you're worried, it's all right if I touch you on the arm. Yes, that's fine. Thank you very much. They lowered all the lights. We had like kind of fake LED candles and like very sort of abstract but very easy on the eye kind of hangings in the room, so it didn't look like a hospital ward. Rugs on the floor so that the sound was all different. Ambient music, but also music on the headphones. They did it beautifully. And if that means that people who don't go and hang out with ayahuasqueros in South America, or don't go raving or whatever, if those people can get access to that medicine, and good clinicians, and the people I was with were totally, absolutely sound, people who knew the story, very familiar with it, very good. If people can get access to that healing, that's going to be really valuable, particularly at a time in our global history where, as a result of the pandemic, there's going to be a lot of PTSD out there, Basically, anyone who's been working for the health service globally over the last few months, many of those people have got very difficult stories to tell, and many of those people who've been on lockdown in, with their difficult relationship on the top of a tower block somewhere in a city, that's going to be really hard. And so to unpick those things and to help those people, having that stuff available in a license framework is going to be essential. But I'm an advocate of a post-prohibition world. You can't prohibit these substances, and that includes also things like cocaine, heroin, all of that stuff. You've got to deal with it in a much more adult, much more open, much more honest way, as a health and a cultural issue rather than a criminal issue.
Yeah, I think it's a very strong stance, and it's a reasonable one. I think that's the bit that really just confused me. Is like everything you said is entirely reasonable, and but beyond that, it's also data led. And that's a really key thing. It's not an opinion. This is data led. So it's so disappointing to hear kind of when kind of the powers that be take decisions like that are just simply not reading the evidence.
I mean, I guess I take heart in the fact that that radical cultural change is definitely possible. If you look in the United States, even over some periods where there's been a great rise in various things that one might not like so much, the decriminalization process for cannabis, and in some American states and jurisdictions, decriminalization of other kind of entheogenic plants, that's happening. Places like Portugal have got a decriminalized position on just all drugs. So I mean, you can, whilst there are still kind of there's cultural uncertainty, and there's a lot of kind of ways of we have to think about how we deal with this. Portugal had to change its policy because it had so much of a problem with cocaine use and opiate deaths, that it was obvious that the prohibition policy simply was not working, and people were dying, and it was creating huge amounts of suffering. So you have to go, well, even in situations, say in Britain, where the legislation is still kind of relatively repressive, these things will change. Like I was born in 1968. The year before I was born, male homosexuality was decriminalized in Britain. Like, that was a sea change that flew in the face of vast amounts of like religious and cultural change, but was also it was a wave that was rising, and it was something that was going to happen in culture. And I like to think that the changes in drug law will likewise follow suit.
Yeah, absolutely, and I hope so. I mean, I grew up in Catholic Ireland. You know, like I mean, we were literally 20 years behind you guys when when it comes to kind of what just seemed like ludicrous things now. You know, just absurd, but they were, you know, illegal. Your sexuality could be illegal. You know,
I mean, I think some of it is just going to be people kind of these substances, especially when we're talking about psychedelics, they're increasingly kind of part of culture. They're kind of like they're known, they're referenced in like TV, and they're kind of part of the discourse. And there are undoubtedly people who are still very concerned about those things, and you can address some of that with data. You can address some of that with like reasoned argument. You can address some of that with like personal views. But frankly, you can just wait till people die, and then you can kind of go, you know, that, to be honest, that's how a lot of stuff, a lot of social change happens.
it's totally reasonable.
Like,
Yeah,
you know,
yeah.
ideas go into culture, like, oh, perhaps it would be good to not be racist. That might be nice. Do you know what I mean? And you know, eventually people of like, say, my children's generation, who are kind of teenagers now, it's like, that's just, yeah, that stuff is just crazy talk. Like,
Yeah.
You know, so getting those kind of cultural shifts happening, it may seem like a long time from the point of view of one lifetime, but looked at, you know, panning back,
Yeah, it's a blip.
Then
Yeah,
it's a blip.
yeah. That's it's really interesting. And it's a pleasing feeling to acknowledge it as a blip. You know, so one of the things that I'm really keen to get your view on, I know we touched that at the start of the conversation, but the beings that people interact with, and really just to get your thoughts on, you know, what they are. I've heard loads of stories about the kind of the DMT experience, the kind of theriatropic figures that people have, and you know, feelings of being consumed by crocodiles, that the prevalence of reptile beings, all this kind of stuff. It's a really rich tapestry there. Yeah, what is it, Julian?
Oh, mate, I don't know. I mean, first thing is I don't know.
Yeah.
The second thing is that my current thoughts on the matter are that, okay, so let's imagine that you take I don't know, for argument's sake, one of the highly visual ones, ayahuasca or DMT. Firstly, it's interesting to note how in those highly visual things, because we're a visual creature, those of us who are sighted get 70% of our information about the world from sight. And so when we are shown a thing, we are more likely to believe a thing than when we just feel a thing or we hear a thing. Yeah. So the visual ones are the ones that people always go on about, although the encounters with beings or like feelings of the other or like a presence can happen just as easily within salvia or 5-MeO DMT, or in the therapeutic context, clearly it can happen with MDMA. I think what those things are is that they are let's call them spirits for the purposes of the exercise, but what they are rooted in is they are rooted in the biology of us so deeply that they are more real than our individual consciousness is. Now, what I mean by that is, if you think about the entities that are encountered, firstly, they tend to be vertically symmetrical, often hominid-like creatures. Now, you and I, as people who are sighted, the first thing that we understand in the world is the face of our caregiver. So we understand these two eyes and this mouth, right? So that ability to recognize a face, which we can do by looking at the flames in the hearth or the clouds in the sky, we are geared up to see faces. And so when these novel connections happen in the brain and then they arise into awareness, one of the things that we're very likely to perceive is a face, is a being, and to accord agency to that thing. Now, what also we have in our brains is we have systems in our brain that are very responsive to things like non-mammalian movement. So scuttling things and sinuous moving things. Those are things that as a monkey, we're designed to go, whoa, that's important. it's very important that we recognize things that are shiny. It's very important we recognize things that are like eyes or like liquid. And so we have all this kind of structure in our biology, in the biology of our bodies, where there are, if you like, modules within the brain that kind of ping agency, entityhood, and attention. Yeah, so they kind of go, oh, here's a thing, I should pay attention to this. So in a sense, what I think spirits are is they're kind of deep processes which you could sort of look as like archetypes, but they're sort of almost deeper than that, because they're rooted in our fundamental biology, and they arise as these other beings in order very often to communicate something to us. Now, that's not the same as saying that they are not real. Yeah, they are real. They are more real than your consciousness is, in the same way that an archetype, an archetype is a psychological expression of a physiological fact. There's physiological facts like women have babies, right? So the great mother, or the ancient wise person, or the hero, or the child, these are all physiological facts, and they're more real than you and I are. We just happen to be the current incarnation of that underlying structure. And so in the psychedelic state, what we do is we encounter those underlying structures. So to give you an example of this, there's a book called the Masks of God. There's by Joseph Campbell, great mythographer, and he gives an example of that if you have a baby chick, if a hawk passes over the baby chick hunkers down and gets really still because it knows that a predator is there. And Campbell writes, if all the hawks in the world were to disappear tomorrow, the shadow of the hawk would still sleep in the soul of the chick. So the hawk lives deep inside the biology of the chick. And if the chick were tripping and the chick were having an interaction with a powerful radical other that seemed to be predatory, in the same way that the jaguar or the anaconda might be in an ayahuasca trip, the chick would have a trip involving a hawk. Yeah, because that's what its biology is geared up to do. If you and I were starfish, we'd encounter starfish-shaped entities, or entities that were part of the lineage, the ancient history of that life form. But because we're hominids, we tend to encounter things that are a bit hominid-like, like an elf, for example. Yeah. Now, the spirit is the way I would describe it is a spirit is a complex set of interactions which arise in perception in that moment into an apparent other with which we can have an interaction. So you are a complex set of interactions that I'm currently experiencing as a bunch of digital data arising into my awareness in what appears to be an other, so we can have an interaction. Yeah. So this is not the same as saying that they are not real. And it's not the same as saying that they come from an alien world. It's actually like saying these things are all here all the time, continuously present. And what happens in the psychedelic state is that they become kind of revealed to us in some sense, so that we can have this kind of interaction with those beings. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
sort of?
Absolutely. And like, it kind of reminds me of, I mean, it's I'm looking at it from a much more simplistic and far less eloquent the way than you've just described. But that whole idea of the brain being a receiver, and that a substance, it basically changes your bandwidth, what you can perceive, what you can kind of interact and engage with. And I mean, certainly some of the, going back to kind of the therianthropic figures, like the part man, part animal, what we have in mythology, the minotaurs, the centaurs, all that kind of stuff. The bit that really kind of just blows my mind is these things were appearing on the walls of caves. These things were painted on the walls of caves by our ancestors from deep antiquity. And it's to your point, there they are. The very first expressions of human art and human creativity are describing these things. It's incredible.
They're incredibly ancient. If you think about something like, you go into, I've had this. I remember oh, I don't know, like a few years back, like having a an ayahuasca experience where, um, you know, a kind of classic thing, I suppose. I came across this entity, and the entity was, it was kind of almost emblematic of the shame that I carry inside myself. You know, both kind of personal stuff that I don't feel that I've done well in, and also kind of cultural stuff. You know, I'm living here in the British Isles. You know, okay, my ancestors like working class folks, but nevertheless part of an entity that went and predated on the rest of the planet and did bad stuff. So this entity appeared that was emblematic of my shame. How did the entity appear? Well, firstly, it was vertically, you know, bilaterally symmetrical. So it was kind of like an animal, it was like a thing, but it was like this kind of weird lobstery kind of strange. So it was a being, but it was also not it was not mammalian. It was like other, and part of my interaction in that process was to kind of find a way of like being with this thing and kind of interacting with it in such a way that I could come to some new metaphorical way of holding this experience. So the entity looked like a kind of, I don't know, like a strange mashup of, you know, crab meets mantis meets, you know, decaying piece of meat or something. Yeah. So the entity, the shame, is real. Yeah. That experience is the real kind of thing. And what my mind does is, in that moment of interaction and that possibility of learning, the spirit is kind of, the spirit of shame is filtered through all the perceptual architecture of my mind, and it pops out in a form that I, as a piece of hominid biology, am going to pay attention to. So it's got like weird crab claws, and it's got lots of weird eyes, and it's got a mouth, and it's looking at me, you know, and I know this. And so the form in which it arises can be culturally determined. It might be elves for some people, aliens for others, you know, theriomorphic forms for other kind of people. So there'll be little details about that. But then there'll be structural similarities. Oh, well, look, you know, it seemed to have arms, it seemed to have eyes, it appeared to have a mouth, that kind of stuff. And then beyond that, you go into the kind of the deeper sort of territory of the way that we as hominids respond to various forms. And at the root of it is this real thing, this real experience of, say, you know, me as a person sitting there feeling the kind of the ancestral cultural shame or difficulty of my nation, of my people, of my individual self, and therefore the opportunity to do something about that, to find some new way of understanding that, ideally for the benefit of me and everybody else. Yeah. So that's kind of the way I think of those things. So it's not an either or. It's not like they're all just in your head, or it's like they're actually in some kind of like Stargate spirit world that you go to. It's actually that these things are here all the time, and in the psychedelic state, they arise through this perceptual net into something that we can engage with, and that bit is the important bit.
Yeah. That it makes a lot of sense, and that description, that description kind of reminds me of that kind of state, the idea of like the relationship between the observer and the observed, you know, and that this thing, this intelligence, or is observing us, and it's preparing itself into forms that we would understand and be able to kind of symbolically read.
Yeah. I mean, you take the example of eyes. I mean, it's incredibly common for people when they're, let's say they've taken NMDMT, entities with lots of eyes. Well, why is that? Well, eyes are incredibly important. If you're a human, I mean, humans are very unusual mammals because you can see the whites of our eyes, which is, if you think back through all the other animals you can think of, that's very, very rare. Why is that? Well, it's important that humans can see, we perceive the eyes in the way that we do, because it's important for me to know where you're looking. Yeah. So as humans, we do lots of signaling with our eyes. We roll our eyes, we blink our eyes, and we kind of, you can see what someone's looking at. We're massively attuned to eyes. If we are a creature that got most of its information from smell, we would expect to have these kind of psychedelic visions would appear as odor. Yeah. But because we're kind of these visual beings and we're prepped up for eyes, you know, you go through the Erowid accounts, the Psychonaut Wiki accounts, and just count how many times it's like, and then it opened its eye and blah, 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 blah. Or there was loads of eyes floating around. Or you go and look at the work of Alex Gray, and you look at all those amazing pictures with all of these eyes. And that's because of the kind of beast we are. That's, if you like, the spirit beings, in their deep positions. It's almost like they emerge, and as they emerge, they go, right, so what's lurking around here in this monkey's head? Right, okay, it digs eyes. Brilliant. Bolt some eyes on that. All right, it's going to be freaked out by tentacles. Let's get some tentacles out of its reptilian brain and get those. Fantastic. Right, then let's make it look like a hominid, but then let's stick like a bull's head on it. Marvelous. You know, that'll get its attention. That'll get the message through.
I love it. I love it. Again, one of the things that springs to mind is that idea of something preparing symbols and or metaphors or even communicating things that to the individual, that the individual can culturally place, that has cultural context for the individual, even when they were geographically born on the earth. That's the thing that really strikes me about, you know, spirit interaction, or fairy interaction, or alien interaction, or cryptid interaction, or jinn interaction. You know, like a lot of kind of the work that I've been doing is trying to correlate kind of fairies and jinn off the back of kind of just my own work. I'm like, hang on, that's exactly the same thing. But these things are appearing in a totally cultural specific way, exhibiting the same behaviors and having a lot of the same taboos around them, but appear that in a way that's culturally relevant.
And a lot of the similar effects. So things like time dilation. You go underneath a fairy hill. You might think you've been there for a day, but actually that may not be the case. And we know that time dilation is one of the classic things that you get with any psychedelic state, whether that's arrived at through breath work, whether that's arrived at through any number of different substances. So we can see these similarities in, like, you know, well, what happens when we enter these kind of these altered states of awareness, and we encounter these things. And I think it's also interesting when we start to look at substances and experience that are perhaps less visual and still having, but it can still give us a really profound sense of a something. So Terence McKenna, I think I only know of one very brief reference where he talks about 5-MeO-DMT, the stuff that, you know, appears in organic sources, primarily in the venom of the Sonoran desert toad. And he kind of says, oh yeah, it's like this. And it's not really his thing. You can kind of tell he's much more interested in the eye candy, and that's cool. You know, it's his thing, whatever. But 5-MeO-DMT, people talk about it as being this non-dual state and various other things. Certainly my experience of it as well is that there's a sense that you're plugging into a kind of like, to use a Terence McKenna phrase, like the ecology of souls, so that there's this kind of continuous arising of awareness and all the multiple forms of awareness that implies. Or if you take something like ketamine, people often with ketamine, they may not encounter so frequently entities, but they'll sometimes get to a place where they have a sense that they're not alone. They're part of like this, you know, infinitely large space comprising all of these minds, or some kind of computer-like, or for those who remember Tron movie style, you know, lines of interaction between things. It's just most noticeable with certain tryptamines. But I think that the other thing that I was saying about the ritual is that in ritual, what we can do is we can utilize the fact that this is part of our behavior. This is part of our simian behavior. You know, the biggest processing bits of our brains are not the bits that process kind of logical linear stuff. They're actually the bits that process social interaction, because it's the most important thing we have. And so if we can utilize those and piggyback on those by taking the medicine, taking the mushrooms before we're tripping, and interacting with them as though they are a person. Not in a big deal. It doesn't have to be like in a special cultural way. You just talk to it like, okay, mushrooms, right, just for the purpose, and you can call it a mind hack or whatever you want, however you want to frame it. You go, mushrooms, I'm gonna ask you my question. I'm gonna speak to you like a trusted friend, and then I'm gonna take the mushrooms and I'm gonna hope for a journey that allows me to unfold whatever it is I'm unfolding. So we deliberately use the hominid social way that we interact with each other, the way I'm interacting with all the pixels on this screen right now, Yeah. And we do this all the time. You know, we're such a deeply social being. When you go to a movie and you watch people, you know, in the movie doing stuff, and you can see them talking, you can't see them talking. The sound's coming out the speakers at the back of the room. They're not talking. Your brain joins it together because you're used to people talking. Yeah. So with the mushrooms held in your hand before the ceremony, activate that hominid circuit of social interaction there. And then when you're in the situation, you're in the experience, interact with those things in that kind of a way. You know, don't spend your time going, I wonder if this is ontologically real. I mean, that's, you know, what's the point of that? That's like staring at the film and going, this isn't really people actually doing something. This is just a bunch of light and shadow in a darkened room. And that's not how we work, you know? So you kind of actively use that. And that's what I mean by like ritual. It's like you take these behaviors that are normal and that are given and are part of our human birthright. Mm-hmm. And however works for you, you build that into what you're going to do with the medicine.
Wonderfully put. And I'm conscious of time, so to wrap up, I just want to kind of compliment you on the wonderful YouTube series you have, My Magical Thing, which I follow with earnest. It's absolutely fantastic. Would you like to tell the listeners a little bit about it?
Yeah, I mean, it was one of those kind of like side projects. I didn't really. It's kind of weird because I work in museums and galleries and stuff, so I spend a lot of time working with objects and helping people like access their history and their story and like how do we engage with these things. And it was kind of a lockdown project that sort of spiraled out of control. So I just basically thought, well, I'll just do this kind of brief thing where I contact, you know, friends or people that I haven't spoken with before but would like to, and ask to see one of their magical things. And it was only kind of down through some of the shows that a couple of people pointed out to me. I think it was one person pointed out that this is actually quite an interesting kind of slice through contemporary occulture, psychedelic culture, whatever you want to call it. So it's a bit of a sort of an ethnography, anthropology thing. And it's also, I guess, about like if you say to somebody, so what's your practice? What is it you do? You kind of get a rather boring stock answer of, well, I do meditation, and then I kind of, you know, at certain times I'll do a ritual, and it's like this, and it just kind of doesn't really get you very far. But if you say to someone, tell me about this object, tell me about the story, why does this matter to you? You get a lot more information out of that. You know, it's like again, as human beings, when we put something between us, we put something between like you and me, and we both talk about the thing, we reveal a lot more about who we are than if we just set up that one-to-one kind of conversation. Yeah. And this is how things like tarot cards and lots of other processes work, where we have something we can stand back from and reflect. And then by that kind of dialogue process, we get all these interesting teachings. And there's been some fantastic things. I mean, it's lighthearted, it's fun, it's relatively short, most of the films, but there's actually some really deep stuff going on in it. So
it really is
really good to do.
Yeah, there really is. And there's some it's lovely to see the objects that mean things to people, you know, and as you said, the stories around them are really wonderful, and they're very revealing. Like they I mean, much to your point, you know, a lot of the descriptions of what's your practice, we'd get a variation of the same thing, you know, but the meaning that people have to these objects, what they personally mean to them, what's been, I guess, revealed to them through these objects is all wonderful stuff. And yeah, I really enjoy it. It's fantastic, and I do recommend all listeners to go and subscribe to Julian's channel. I'll put the links below. It's a fantastic show, and long may it continue. Julian, I'm conscious of time. I've just had a fantastic time talking to you. It's been a great hour. The hour's whizzed by. Hopefully we can get you back again at some stage and have another chat. Where's the best place for people to find you?
Probably the easiest thing is there's a blog that I've been running since about 2011 called the Blog of Baphomet.com. And there's loads and loads of articles by me and various other people on that. If you look on the sidebar, there's links to, like, I've got like an online teaching site that and various other kind of things that I do that people might be interested in, you know, books and all that sort of shiz. I mean, check out the blog site is probably the easiest one. And, you know, if people are nice and friendly and all that kind of stuff, they can find me on Facebook and Instagram and Twitter and, you know, all the usual stuff.
Yeah, awesome. Julian, thank you so much for your time. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you on the Spirit Box.
Dara, thank you so much for inviting me. Really appreciate it, man. Cheers.
Cheers.
Thank you, Julian. I really enjoyed that. I love how Julian explained why he believed this intelligence reveals itself in the way it does, from the basic archetypes that have deep symbolic meaning to us at our core, to simple biological indicators of meaning that allow us to recognize other life forms, intelligent life forms. There's such a lot to take from that explanation that can be used to look at the other related phenomena, such as the cryptids we discussed in last week's show. I mean, imagine how pure meaning and consciousness without material form would communicate. Imagine being outside of linear time and trying to express an idea or just make contact to a form of life locked into it. What would it do to make the process of interaction and communication more accessible? Would it reveal the medicine within a vine, a mushroom, or a cacti? Perhaps nudge them along to eat, drink, or smoke this sacred soma and bring them into their world where time doesn't exist, where language is symbols and symbols is meaning, and in the process terrify them, heal them, and inspire them. And isn't it interesting that all those components that make up the reported psychedelic experiences, both during and after, sound so familiar to the alien and fairy encounter? The time distortion, the terror, the healing, the inspiration. Food for thought. Literally food for thought. Okay, that's it from me. Talk soon.